I sort of want to, Steve and I want to sort of engage you and maybe enrage you and present some new ideas that you may not have heard before. I've been sitting through this conference and I don't think anybody has defined war. So what is this thing that we call war? I'm going to present some definitions. I'm going to talk about the issue, is war a part of human nature? Are we a warring species? I'm going to point out that the evidence suggests that we're not. I will then try to look at violence in general and classify two kinds of violence. Then Steve will talk for a while, and then I'll come back and raise the issues of what Neil suggested would be primordial prevention of war. I think it's possible. And so let's sort of look at that. What is war? War is something that is carried out collectively with deadly force, and you envision that others will be killed. That deadly force is legitimate, it's morally appropriate, and it's justified. So societies go to war. Very different than homicide. Homicide is something that an individual carries out against another individual. And the redress for that is capital punishment. And different countries accept capital punishment in various forms. We heard about that the other night. So war is armed conflict carried out collectively. Societies go to war. So when the United States goes to war, we are going to war. It's not them, it is us. Is war a part of the human species? Well, if you look at a book like Leviathan, written by Thomas Hobbes in 1651, he describes that the state of men without civil society, which state may be called the state of nature, is nothing but a war of all against all. So he would suggest that our human nature is one of all of us warring with each other. And that he also describes life in that kind of condition as being nasty, brutish, and short. So you find books such as this one, War Before Civilization. In other words, what was war? What were societies like before civilization? For most of human existence on this earth, 95% of our time, we lived as primitive forager-hunter societies. It's only in the last 10,000 years that we, with the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, that we adopted agriculture, and we've had civilizations for perhaps 5,000 years. And Keeley would argue that before civilization we warred, as Thomas Hobbes suggested, and he describes the myth of the peaceful savage. So on what basis does he make this claim that humans by nature are not peaceful? Well, what he does is look at the existing evidence in the last 100 years on a variety of forager-hunter societies and the historical evidence on warring to show that the percentage killed and wounded was highest among hunter-forager societies within the last century, and then comparing it with Athens or Rome or the British or the Greeks, suggesting that just in the numbers killed, the hunter-gatherers in the last century did more than the civilized societies. He also makes the point that they took more land. They claimed more land as a percentage for losses. He also suggested that the actual fatality rates by the hunter-gatherer societies fighting in the last century were much higher than France, Japan, Russia, Germany, for example. But he's taking small groups whose societies have been constrained. They have a certain number of deaths, and the denominator is not very big, so the percentage is very high. That would be one way to look at that. He also suggests that the percentage of people dying were much higher in these prehistoric and primitive groups. So is that in fact a true characterization of our species? Are we in our native state, in our aboriginal state, a warring species who is violent? Well, along comes another scientist who wrote a book called Warless Societies and the Origins of War. And he suggests that we need to take a more careful examination of the data. And what he finds is that war and society co-evolve. As we make so-called progress, then warring progresses with us. And he says that in the Upper Paleolithic, before the transition to farming societies, that groups that he called unsegmented foraging societies had very little war. And the more they became segmented, the more war there was. And so he said that what was the transition from these very simple societies to the more complex societies that led to war? One thing was the unsegmented, the more primitive, had social groups limited to family and kin. When they married outside of their group. And these kinship relationships did not involve any marriage payments. And you can sort of see that if there was no bride price, there was no dowry, then there was no accumulation of wealth that we required to do that. And if you married outside of your group, then you didn't build up power structures within your group. So that's the important point about high group exogamy. He suggested 40% of the marriages have to occur outside of the group. Once they get concentrated in the group, then you get power that is passed on through marriage. And so he presented as data, for example, various groups for which we have information and how much they were warless and how much they were warlike, depending on the percentage of marriages inside or outside the group. He also said that once people stopped migrating as much, because if you look at groups, they would, if they were more sedentary, they were more warlike. As well, if they stored food, they were more warlike. Once you had stuff that other people might want, they would go to war. So he looked at the mobility of foraging societies and showed that the ones that were the most migratory, the most mobile, had many fewer wars than the ones that were more sedentary and stored food. Food storage then is an important thing because most of these groups in the more recent times practiced mixed agricultural and hunting and gathering, and the more they had agriculture, the more they stored food, the more there was a reason to go to war. And food storage is just another, is just a proxy for wealth accumulation. Finally, if there was a population density that increased to the point of 0.2 to 5 people per square mile, in other words, if they were densely together, they were more likely to go to war. And so he looked at population density and the look of warring amongst that. So I think we can conclude, and there's lots of other evidence, that human beings by nature are not a warring species. I think we moved into warring as our societies became civilizations, as we had stuff, as we had a hierarchy develop in which one person would say, I'm your lord, your master, build me a castle, store the food you grow for me inside, and build a moat around it to protect me. The fact that we're an altruistic species is pointed out by the fact that we will go to war for our lord or master and die to protect that. So we, by nature, I think, care for others because we are willing to die for that. We are not, but we are not at heart a warring species. So what can we say about the world and its transition from the Neolithic to the present? Well, what's happened is that we have had what historians call the Great Divergence. That is, for most of the last 10,000 years, the income per person has remained very low. But it's only with the Industrial Revolution a couple of hundred years ago that the Great Divergence occurred, with many becoming phenomenally rich, and this country is a prime example, and then we had those who got poorer. And so this economic historian, Gregory Clark, writes about this in his book, A Farewell to Alms, A Brief Economic History of the World. He writes on page 3, there walk the earth now, both the richest people who have ever lived and the poorest. And I think that's really true. We have seen incredible wealth that has just been unfathomable in the past, and we see it among nations especially. And so these are some old data from the United Nations looking at the wealth gaps by country from 1820 to 1997. And the biggest wealth gap back in 1820 was between the United Kingdom and China. The ratio was 3 to 1. In 1997, the United States versus Sierra Leone, 74 to 1. And that has almost certainly increased today. So today, the United States, for example, has 40% of all the billionaires in the world. We also have the person with the highest wage earned last year. I don't know if any of you know how much the highest wage last year was. It was $2 million an hour. It was $4 billion a year. And of course, we all believe in this country that that's nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you try. So we all believe that we can get there someday. So along comes Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett in their book, The Spirit Level. And it's an unfortunate title. The Spirit Level is the British carpenter's level. But the subtitle, Why Greater Equality Makes Societies Stronger. This book argues that most things get better when there is more equality in society. And our president was very close to this book. This is the front page of the New York Times last month. He's holding a book about Karl Rove, but right there on that pile is The Spirit Level. So he got at least this close to these ideas. We can say that. So what is the main argument of The Spirit Level? The argument is if you take most of the things that we value in society and graph them on a low-income inequality to high-income inequality scale, we find that the higher the income inequality, the worse the outcomes for, there's the United States compared to all these other European and rich countries. We have lower levels of trust, mental illness, life expectancy, obesity, children's educational performance, teenage birth, homicides, imprisonment, and social mobility. So they got Z-scores for the statisticians of all of these different indicators from reputable sources. They aggregated them and they plotted them against a common scale for income inequality. And so if you look at these indicators, you realize, yes, we have a lot of income inequality in this country, and if you look around us, things are not going well. I think many of us can believe that. They also did the same argument for US states. And so they took the same indices from better to worse with the same measures of income inequality, and there's the worst off states, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Kentucky, and down here are the Midwestern, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Iowa, Utah, New Hampshire, Minnesota, North Dakota. And if we look at a map of the United States and we look at these various indicators, we can see that there are southeastern states, which are the worst off for most things, and the Midwestern states, which are the best off. And the argument is made that this is more a reflection of income distribution than anything else. Criminologists and sociologists have known that homicide rates are very patterned by the inequality among countries. So here's the United States with our high homicide rate, and there are all these other countries down there. The same relationship is true within US states. If you ask the question, what are the associations of inequalities with most of the things that we value, you'll find people reporting this everywhere. So I just want to point out one paper by a Harvard economist, Alberto Alesina, Income Distribution, Political Instability, and Investment. Political instability is a euphemism for war. So income distribution is linked in this regression analysis to warring societies and the investment that goes into that picture. Well, we think war is obviously very violent, and the violence is behavioral. And most of this conference has addressed that. But if you actually ask the question, how much carnage is there from war, and how does that compare with the carnage from what I've suggested, namely the inequality in society, you then have to come up with a term called structural violence. It's a term that comes out of the peace research literature back in the 1960s. by Galton and others. Paul Farmer has talked about structural violence. Basically, we all know what behavioral violence is. It's discrete. There's a gunshot that goes on, a plane flies into a building, individuals are harmed, and it's visible. But structural violence is one in which the inequality in society is like a highly toxic, odorless, invisible gas that kills, and we're totally unaware of it. And we die of the usual diseases. The point made of the spirit level, we die from heart attacks and strokes and diabetes and infections. So we have no smoking gun, and it happens continuously. So if you take that definition of structural violence and you ask, well, how bad is the carnage? And you add up, say, all the war deaths in the last century, you come up to about 110 million. If you ask, well, how many structural violence deaths are there per year? And I just take 1 year, 1997, in the world, you come up with about 15, 16 million deaths a year that can be attributed to structural violence, or about a fifth or sixth of all the war deaths the entire last century. And it's this highly toxic, invisible, odorless gas that kills from all the usual diseases. So Gilligan, a psychiatrist at Harvard who wrote a book on violence, concludes that structural violence is the main cause of violent behavior, and eliminating structural violence means eliminating relative poverty. The cure for poverty is money. But it's like the elephant in the room. I'm right here in the room and no one even acknowledges me. We do not acknowledge inequality. But some do. President Carter, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, in his speech said, "I was asked to describe the greatest challenge the world faces, and I decided the most serious and universal problem is the growing chasm between the richest and poorest people on earth." Amartya Sen, another Nobel Prize winner, at this time in economics, says, "I believe that virtually all the problems of the world come from inequality of one kind or another." So how many is it killing in the United States? A paper published last fall in the British Medical Journal suggested that 883,000 deaths a year occur in the United States because our income inequality is above a Gini index of 0.3. Forget exactly what that means, but most Western European countries are much more equal and have a lower Gini index. Well, 883,000 deaths a year is about 1 death in 3. So one could estimate that 1 death in 3 in this country results from the inequality that we all love, and it's what makes America great. So let me pause at this point and ask Steve to carry on.
Thanks very much. Steve makes a great point about structural violence. And what I'd like to do is to talk about a little bit about the origins of war from a particular American perspective, a US perspective, and its relationship to structural violence. Because if it's true, which I will posit to you, if it's true that war exacerbates or maintains structural violence, and this is above and beyond the kinds of things that Stephen's talking about, that it may well be that the effects of war in terms of its effect on structural violence are as great or greater than the direct and indirect effects of war, the ones that are commonly considered. I'd like to focus primarily on the US role, with all apologies to those of you non-Americans. I suspect you have your own problems with war and origins of war, but we as Americans have particular problems, and I think by the time I finish, I hope to make it clear that as Martin Luther King said, that the US is the major force causing war in the world today, when he said that in I think 7, and it's true still. I want to talk about how the US government uses war and violence to protect US corporate interests, to protect local elite partners around the world, and to crush populist movements against repressive governments. Not all wars that the US fights follow these characteristics, but I would suggest to you that the majority, and probably the overwhelming majority, of the wars that the US fights meet these objectives. These wars impede efforts to improve health through reduction, that the efforts to improve health through reduction of poverty and disparity are impeded because of these wars, whether or not we're supporting repressive governments, or that impede efforts to improve equity, or whether we're supporting, whether we're making it very difficult for any efforts to address these issues of structural violence. And then finally, that we have a special responsibility as Americans to address war that's waged in our name. I show this particular graphic to a number of my courses, so apologies to you, but basically showing that there's a pretty strong relationship between diseases that do the majority of the killing in the world today around proximate, intermediate, and underlying issues, all of which create this inexorable force towards disease. And as physicians, nurses, healthcare workers, we tend to work in this kind of environment where we either treat disease or deal with the proximate causes of disease. What we're doing in this conference is we're looking at militarism, imperialism, war, as it reflects poverty and disparity in this whole process, creating disease. And we'll talk about how these processes work out. The first thing I want to suggest to you is that there have been efforts, pretty well documented, over the last half century, where we've made remarkable progress in terms of reducing mortality in a number of places in the world. And that progress has come about through a number of areas. I've just taken 5. I've taken the state of Kerala in India, which is about 30 million in a place that's actually fairly populated, some people say overpopulated, the country of China, the country of Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and South Korea. 3 of which, Taiwan, South Korea, and China, are autocratic dictatorships, or were when these improvements took place. 2, Sri Lanka and Kerala, were democratic republics. Some were socialists, these 3 were socialists, these 3 were capitalists, but they all had common policies, and those policies were extremely clear. They had primary education, universal and compulsory, housing, water, and sanitation, food, agricultural subsidies, land reform. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, they had protection of their nascent industries, and they all had simple and universal health services. These are clearly the principal strategies to reduce poverty and disparity. Taiwan and South Korea had growth strategies, so they grew a lot. These others didn't. They didn't grow as much, but they all had remarkable improvements of health. And the common denominator for these improvements was that they required government intervention in terms of taxation to be able to support these public policies. And these policies, and the taxation in particular, are almost inevitably resisted by elites. If we look at U.S. military inventions, and I want to give you kind of a personal view, at least for a bit, is that by the 1980s, I grew up here in Seattle with the idea that the U.S. got involved in wars to either protect ourselves or to deal with this issue around the Cold War, that is, to protect the world against the ravages of communism. And, like many folks, Vietnam was my sort of entry into this whole conversation. And pretty quickly it became clear that what was going on in Vietnam was that we were supporting a repressive government against an effort by not just North Vietnam, but by the South Vietnamese, who were trying to overthrow that government and to install more of a socialist, equity-oriented society. Interestingly enough, Vietnam has been one of the most successful societies in the world in terms of reducing their mortality since 1975, since the Americans left. It's rarely sort of published or noted in this country. Then I started looking backwards at Cuba and Guatemala, and in front towards Angola, Mozambique, where I worked a number of years, then El Salvador, Nicaragua. And you start scratching your head and you say, hey, what's going on here? It kind of looks like in every one of these instances, we are fighting against the forces of equity in our wars. So I want to give you a couple of examples of these, and then we'll go into some sort of broader examples. Let's look at Guatemala. It's by no means the only example, but Guatemala is a war that wasn't a huge war. There were probably only 400 soldiers supported by the United States. But what we did is we rescued the United Fruit Company from equity strategies in Guatemala. That in 44, a very small proportion of the population owned about 70% of the land. The United Fruit Company was enormous. It had its own armies, its own phone, telegraph, their own port, its own railroad. It was basically a state within a state. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz was elected as on the platform of land reform. And by 1953, he had expropriated, is a little bit of a tough word, because he offered to buy a portion of the United Fruit Company's land, about 70–80% of which was being unused. And he said during that time is that foreign capital will always be welcome as long as it adjusts to local conditions and remains subordinate to Guatemalan laws, cooperates with the economic development of the country, and strictly abstains from intervening in the nation's social and political life, which of course was not the case with United Fruit Company. Of interest is the fact that United Fruit Company is a company where some of the directorship of the country was shared by the Bush family and the Walker family. The U.S. government supported United Fruit Company because they complained that Guatemalan government was getting into their face. They claimed that Arbenz was tolerant of communists, which was patently untrue at that time. So the CIA financed arms payments to government opponents, created this army, and in 1954 Arbenz was ousted. This ended the 10-year period of democracy in Guatemala, followed by a series of U.S.-backed dictators between '54 and the late '80s, a guerrilla movement that lasted until the late '80s, and over 70,000 citizens were killed. So you could say the problem is 70,000 citizens, but I would say perhaps the bigger problem was the lost opportunity for equity strategies to take Guatemala back to its own sovereignty and to be able to deal with education, healthcare, and some of these others. Mozambique's another country, one that I know well, had U.S.-backed Portuguese colonialism until '74, with very limited housing, jobs, healthcare for Africans. Independence, after independence from '75 to '82, the socialist government rapidly expanded equity strategies with education, health, jobs, with the public control over key resources, particularly mining and fishing. We saw a rapid mortality decline during that period of time. Really fairly unprecedented, certainly in Mozambique and in African history. And then South Africa created a war between '82 and '92, which the United States backed, which undermined the government equity strategies, attacking specifically schools and clinics to undermine this social experiment, this example of an alternative way of development. And it was actually quite successful. They really undermined and brought the country to its knees. So what that suggests, and if you look at the 7 examples that I gave, is that if a foreign leader threatens U.S. interests by increasing taxation and regulation, or if a resistance to repressive governments threatens U.S. interests, you better watch out. You can realistically expect threats, overthrow, assassination, covert action, and armed intervention. And this has enormous influence on health, because it just makes it hard to adopt the strategies that we know that are going to work. So then you look at, okay, well, what have we done? Well, there's a book by William Bloom that was published, I think 2005. It should be in the bottom, but I can't see it here. That outlines over 70 U.S. interventions since World War II alone. 70 interventions. And I'll leave this up here just a little bit, just so you can see. What I've tried to do is, going through Bloom's and my own sort of historical perspective, is to try to get a sense of what the justifications were for each one of these wars. I think it's pretty clear that this is not fighting for U.S. security, it's something else. And that something else might be anti-communism, but when you look at most of these anti-communism issues, that there's an element of protecting our national, not our national interests, but our corporate interests in some of these interventions. It's actually pretty scary when you look at the numbers of interventions, one every couple of years. And the other thing, by the way, is that this goes well beyond the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended in 1989, and after 1989, the pattern is approximately the same in terms of numbers of interventions. This outlines some of the assassinations that we've attempted, suggesting that we don't always have to go to war to attain the same objectives. So, if you look at the interventions since the Cold War, since 1945, the real question is that, is this just Cold War or is it something else? William Bloom suggests, when he wrote this book, is that it's to make the world safe for American corporations, to prevent the rise of a society that might serve as a successful alternative to the capitalist model, to extend political economic domination over as wide areas as possible, as befits a great nation, which is commonly said, great power, and enhances the finances of defense contractors who contributed generously to members of Congress. But if you look, that there's a lot that's prior to the Cold War as well. I've told you that since the Cold War ended, that really hasn't seen much change. And then prior to the Cold War, I've been sort of struggling with trying to get a sense historically of what's happened. And you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the U.S. Marine Corps hymn or fight song is one of my favorite songs, you know, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It's a great song, and when you look at it, it starts telling you what some of the issues are well before the Cold War. This song came about, I think it's the oldest military song, official song, 1891 it came about. And the halls of Montezuma refer to the attack on the Chapultepec Castle in Mexico, which was part of our 1846 to 1848 takeover of Mexico, which resulted in the expansion of the United States and our conquest of Texas, California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Okay, well, that was a war that really benefited a lot of the interests of the United States, particularly the elite. The shores of Tripoli are a war that we had against Tripoli, Tunis, Morocco, and Algiers between 1801 and 1805 that were about the Barbary pirates protecting U.S. shipping lanes during that period of time. I went to the Philippines and read a book about the Philippines War, and it turns out that the Philippine-American War was really a war that we fought against the Philippine people, keeping their independence movement at bay, which ended up being a war that actually went until 1913. And when you read it, it has really terrible sort of parallels to what we did in Vietnam, you know, with protected villages that were bombed from the sea, et cetera. The estimates were that between 250,000 and 1 million Filipinos lost their lives in this war of independence that we were trying to snuff out. And then you look at the 29 interventions in Latin America from 1890 to 1940. And these are the countries, there are 13 countries that we've intervened in. And these are the number of interventions in Argentina and Chile only once each, but in Haiti, Nicaragua, you know, 7 times in Nicaragua, Panama 6 times, et cetera. And, you know, so it certainly suggests that there's been a lot of interventions prior to these other ones. So if you put them all together, it comes close to 100 different interventions. Major General Smedley Butler of the United States Marine Corps, on his retirement speech in 1933, said that he spent 33 years in the Marine Corps being a high-class muscle man for big business, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half-dozen Central American republics for the rebirth, for the benefits of Wall Street. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916, and in China I helped to see that the Standard Oil went its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I feel that I could have given Al Capone a few hints. So this is from the inside. So what I would suggest, in taking on Bloom's arguments, is that to tease out this a little bit, that most of these wars, you know, clearly don't follow a Cold War pattern. They do appear to be imperialist wars where the primary motivation is to promote our national interests, but our national interests globally aren't the interest of us here in this room. They're global capitalist interests, which refer to access to markets, often preferential markets, cheap labor and raw materials, reduced taxation and regulation of corporations, privatization, security for investments, and control of key resources such as oil. And it usually means protection of the unequal status quo, which is getting back to what Stephen was talking about. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that we've gotten better at this, and that war is not always necessary anymore, because we can achieve the same corporate purposes, frankly, by our trade agreements, by debt and structural adjustment programs, and by foreign aid. Okay, so I would hope that war is reduced as a result of these new tools, but it still raises the question of what are we doing in terms of undermining these equity strategies. And this is my diagram that I kind of like to show, which is that, you know, if we look at our protection of our vital interests, which are transnational corporations, that we could do it through our economic policies, our soft policies, our aid policies, which are still soft and looking like they're benevolent. If these don't work, then we go to covert action, and if those don't work, we go to military. So this is where our military is, but I think what we have to figure out is, well, why do we do our military actions, and what can we do to stop them? What's the health impact of these imperialist wars? Well, how much mortality increase do we actually get, or do we see a potential mortality decline? Fairly frequently, although not enough, we've tried to understand the epidemiology of war by mortality increase, from Les Roberts' work in Iraq to some of the work that Dick Garfield has done. We haven't really looked at mortality decline as an opportunity loss for social change, sort of looking at this idealized theory of development where you've got social action from land reform to education, healthcare, et cetera, and to see whether that actually improves indicators of education, healthcare, Gini index, mortality, and increased life expectancy. It's tough to do, and I'm going to show you just three examples of attempting to do that. From countries that I know, because every country is quite difficult to sort of make the connection between the imposition of these equity strategies and, in fact, mortality outcomes. We've got this lag effect, and it's tough. But just in Mozambique, if you look at mortality rates, and these are all under 5 mortality rates, in all 3 slides I'll show you, these are the mortality rates. Here's the mortality rates prior to the end of colonialism, which again was supported by the US government. We supported the colonial regime. Once colonialism was broken, education flowered. The health system expanded tremendously, very quickly, and you can see a mortality rate, and these are UN mortality figures that dropped tremendously. And so I just made this really silly, calculation of looking at the 15 million population times the 4.5% birth rate times the numbers of deaths, and I said it looked like it was about 50 deaths per 1,000 that were averted. So I just figured that would be your annual aversion, and I figured that, well, we probably saved 33,000 lives from equity strategies, just on that alone. You know, who knows how close that is. Try to do the same thing with Iran, which is kind of interesting. You had the Shah of Iran during a period of time. You had the Islamic Revolution. And the Islamic Revolution did approximately what happened in Vietnam. That is, we threw off the Americans, whether it was the Shah or the American-backed puppet government, and suddenly the mortality rates dropped as a result of their social equity strategies. And look at these mortality rates. It's pretty amazing. So if you look at 40 million as the population of Iran during that period, 4% birth rate, I figured this was about 100 over a 10-year period, about a drop of 100 per 1,000 mortality rates. Then you get about 160,000 kids who are saved every year. And these are just kids. Nicaragua, same thing. We looked at about 9,000. So you can see that, although this is not terribly scientific, it certainly suggests to you that we're talking fairly big numbers of either deaths that are averted or deaths that aren't averted if this doesn't occur, particularly if we undermine any efforts along these lines. The analysis needs lots more work. We need a more precise definition of the timing of war, mortality figures, inclusion of social indicators. But nevertheless, the information suggests that imperialist wars may have a health impact greater than its direct and indirect consequences. There are reasons to be optimistic about this. Now you say, well, how can you be optimistic? We talked about torture yesterday, and now we're talking about the Americans now. Well, a couple of things. One is that if these are American wars, then it's actually, we should be a lot more optimistic than if, war is this inevitable process, and about as easy to stop as plate tectonics, and we can stop them because they're coming about in our names from our country, those of us who are Americans. There are global anti-war movements that are the largest in history. We have outrage in this country that's pretty amazing that we can use. The 60s and 70s, activism actually temporarily changed the military and the CIA, and some of the policies around the militarization actually improved during that period. And then we let them go in the 90s, and we're letting them go today. Expansion of equity strategies in Latin America, and I only have, I think, about 7 countries here. There are 10 countries who have actually elected presidents on the basis of anti-neoliberal strategies. That is, against American-dominated inequity strategies that have been dominating those countries. And then the 2008 elections in this country, we hope, make a difference. But it's clear that this is not just Iraq and Afghanistan when we look at wars, and that our current military policies are not an aberration, but they're in fact a continuation of long-standing imperialist policies. So what do? We understand the US wars in the light of imperialism. We support anti-militarism efforts in general, knowing where they're coming from. There are a lot of anti-war organizations, and we've talked about them in this, throughout this conference. equity movements as well, Oxfam results, HAI, Partners in Health. I think all of us can be witnesses. We're health workers. It was asked this morning, how can a non-health worker, or how can we as health workers actually do this kind of work? And the fact is, as health workers, or as workers ourselves, we see the consequences of these policies. And we should be witnesses to those consequences. And these are some examples of the people who have done that and have written about that. And then finally, we can question our assumptions, including the assumptions that Steve and I give you. Thank you very much.
So what about some primordial ways of preventing war? I want to present the examples of two countries that don't go to war and how they achieve that. And I want to suggest that the United States knows how to write a constitution for a country so it will never go to war. Because we did that very successfully after we destroyed Japan. So at the end of the Second World War, we occupied Japan. The leader of the occupation was General Douglas MacArthur. And we basically wrote Japan's constitution where we put a peace clause, Article 9. Article 9 says the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. We wrote that for them. That's in their constitution. It's very hard to go to war if your constitution says you can't do that. Now, what have we been doing in the last 10, 20 years? We're trying to get Japan to revise its constitution and revoke Article 9. It's really quite interesting. We wrote it for them. Now we're trying to tell them that they want to revoke it, but they're not buying it. So what was Japan's response to having us tell them no war? One can look at the art that was present around in the after-war period. This is Kato Etsuro, and these are the warlords running away, and the people's shackles have been broken. I think we could do similar things in this country and basically pass an amendment to the Constitution saying the United States shall resolve all disputes peacefully. It's in our midst to do that. What were the health consequences of the occupation that we did in Japan? It's the most rapid improvements in health ever seen. These are crude death rates. In 1945 to 1955, it was the most rapid decline in death rates, the most rapid improvement in health ever seen on the planet. Just to look at life expectancy calculations, since I like those, this is from 1960 to 1983 with just a handful of countries. Notice we're down there by the bottom, but there's Japan. I mean, this just doesn't happen very often in human history when health improves so rapidly. And so now Japan is the healthiest country in the world, the longest lived, the lowest infant mortality. Any indicator you look at, if you graph it compared to other countries, Japan is at the top or near the top. Meanwhile, during the same period of time, our health compared to other countries has declined. So in what I call the Health Olympics right now, we're tied for 25th. And in the early 1950s, at the time we were giving Japan the medicine it needed to become the healthiest country in the world, we were close to being one of the healthiest. So yes, our health improves, it just improves faster in all the other rich countries. So we're paying a huge price. We basically die young for living in the United States. Now, I've done something else here. I put a blue arrow on Costa Rica, because Costa Rica represents another example of what countries can do to not have war, not have an army. Costa Rica decided having an army was kind of a useless thing to do. It was expensive. They could spend the money on other things. And so Costa Rica does not have an army. So I would suggest that those are two examples of primordial ways of preventing war. One is to make it impossible by saying you can't go to war in your constitution. And the other way would be to not have an army, since you can't go to war without a military. I just want to point out Costa Rica is healthier. They have more life expectancy remaining at age 50 than we do. Japan, of course, has the most, and it's not due to the Japanese healthcare system. The Japanese smoke the most. It's not due to their diet or personal behaviors. It's due to the equity strategies that we imposed on them. It was really quite amazing. So I could present more life expectancy data just to show you that this is life expectancy at age 65 for women from 1960 to 2000. Japan was the lowest back in 1960, but now they're the highest. The United States wasn't doing so bad then, but we're now England has surpassed us. This is 2000 data. At every level of health indicators, we don't do well in the comparisons with other countries. So many of you are around age 25. What are your chances of surviving to age 65 to retire if you live in the United States or whether you live in other countries? This is the United States. These are all the other rich countries. Your chances of surviving to age 65 if you're 25 are higher in these other countries if you're a man, and in all these other countries if you're a woman. This is published by the United States Congress in 1992. So it's not like our leaders aren't aware of this, it's just that most of us are totally unaware. And these are all Western European countries for the most part, and it's interesting to consider that in the first half of the 20th century, through wars, they almost destroyed one another. They were the big aristocracies, the great dispersions of wealth inequality. In the second half of the 20th century, they embraced peace, and they've been the healthiest part of the world and the most egalitarian. So they learned their lessons about warring, and now now they enjoy the best health in the world, and we could do the same thing if we recognize that economic inequality is hazardous to our health. So let me stop at this point, and I think we should entertain some questions, since I think a lot of you have some issues probably to raise about these ideas.
Thank you to Steve and Steve, and you can come up to the mics, and we have about 7 minutes for questions, so make them quick.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation, and I'm right on board with you on U.S. imperialism and inequality, but I'd like to challenge some of your conclusions. That chart you just showed, Israel and Cyprus are ahead of us too. Israel, I think, is one of the most militaristic societies on the earth. Cyprus is only dividing two peoples who would like to kill each other, basically. So I'm not sure I would jump to the conclusions from that data. I realize your whole presentation wasn't based on that. But more importantly, I'd like to ask whether the conclusions drawn here throw water on the very passionate speech we heard from Chris Hedges on Friday night, which to me got more to the heart of why we continue to have wars. I agree your conclusions on inequality, but I would say Western Europe has had plenty of proxy wars going on as much as we've had, maybe not as much. No one does it as well as we do. But I think at the end of the day, it is leaders behaving immorally. And whether the cause is imperialism or inequality, when we allow our leaders to arrive at immoral choices for conflict, even a leader like Jimmy Carter signed a presidential directive to develop first strike nuclear weapons. So I just would like to challenge the conclusion that structural issues can help us diminish the chances of war. I like what Chris Hedges said, that we have to really look at the fact that we do like war. You started out by saying complex societies develop war, and therefore as societies get more complex, there's a greater propensity for war. That's a tautology. And I would argue we have wars because people like, especially men, like to have wars, and we allow that, our leaders, to make that kind of an immoral choice, whatever the underlying factors are. So thank you for letting me.
Kind of an interesting way. Let me respond to that in a futuristic sense. We in this country are graying. We're getting older. The number of young people who are going to be able to go to war is going to decline progressively over time. An Afghani woman pointed out up in Vancouver last fall that there are two superpowers in the world. One is the United States with its incredible military might and economic wealth, and the other is you. All of us in this room and the 4 or 5 billion throughout the world represent the other superpower. And the one superpower only exists because we let them. As we gray, we won't have as much testosterone wanting to go to war, and if we recognize our collective superpower status, we can throw the bums out, the leaders. And I think we have to recognize our collective superpower status and recognize the leaders only serve at our own intention.
Just a response to the issues of causation of wars. I agree that men like wars more than perhaps the alternative. Rich men like wars more than just men in general. Margaret Thatcher was a very warring person, so I think that it's complex. And I think understanding what forces people like Jimmy Carter or perhaps even Barack Obama undergo from the powers in Washington that are phenomenally important, understanding how they have to react to these powers, seems to me has to be part of the calculus that brings us to war.
Hello. Thanks for your presentations. I hope you have more of them, writing and things together. Make a great team. My question is, Professor Gloyd, your top state was Kerala as a model, and Professor Bezruchka, your top country was Japan as a model. I just find it interesting that Kerala has the highest suicide rate in India, and Japan has the highest suicide rate amongst all industrial countries. Just something to throw out there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that in more unequal societies, our aggression, our feelings are directed outward at others and commit homicides, wars, that sort of thing. In more equal societies, your feelings are directed more inward, and you're more likely to commit suicide. You're more, and Kerala and Japan presenting examples of that. Suicide's much more complex than that, and I think Durkheim's statements 100 years ago point out that it's a societal thing in a variety of ways. But as a general rule, the more unequal, the more we direct our violence outside, the more equal, the more we internalize the violence. And I suppose you have to take your choice. I'd rather have a more equal society.
I too would rather have a more equal society. I also remember, having lived a number of years in Mozambique, that suicides were extremely common in Mozambique, both during the period of time when things seemed to be okay and getting better, and also during the time when things weren't so okay. I wonder, what the reporting of suicide is and how much you can be confident that you're really seeing a difference between places like Kerala and Mozambique.
We'll take these last two questions.
Okay. This question is directed toward Dr. Gloyd. You mentioned briefly that that political activism during the Vietnam War was very high in the United States, and there has been a decline, even though there's been probably more, or just as much warfare since the 60s. And I'm interested to know if there has been any studies or kind of coalition, coalitions around the political activity and pharmaceutical Americans taking pharmacy drugs. So has there been any studies, or have you seen the coalition? Or
can you define what you mean by the link between activism and pharmaceuticals in the sense of big pharma and the influence of big pharma, or illicit drug taking?
So there's more people using antidepressants, for instance, like Prozac and different antidepressants, and antidepressants do make people quite complacent. So my question to you, is there any studies to kind of to study that, if there's an effect between political activism and more?
That's a really interesting point. I'd never thought of it before, frankly. And gosh, wouldn't that be nice if we could maybe we should give antidepressants to the ruling class too. I think that might work. I actually think the big issue is the draft. During the Vietnam War, half of the people in this room watching a conference like that would have to think about their own involvement in the military. Right now, if you're in this room, the likelihood of your having to go to Iraq or Afghanistan is pretty low, because we have a class-based system of inscription into wars. And I think that's done a remarkable job at undermining the level of resistance to these wars. As long as the poor fight our wars, I think that we will continue to fight them until we have a really massive resistance.
I think Steve and I both grew up in the 1960s when, as students, we marched and demonstrated. We now consume half of all the antidepressants in the world. We live in a pharmacracy. And Richard Layard has actually written about how being on the SSRIs makes you less likely to organize, to sort of band together, and to think that the status quo is anything other than okay. So yes, it has been considered. I think that those of us who don't consume SSRIs, we probably get their metabolites in the water. So it's much more pervasive than whether you actually take the pill or not.
Hi, my name is Mike Diedrich. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, Chapter 92, and we've got a display out there. I'm also a Vietnam combat veteran, and I'd like to follow up on the remarks this woman made earlier about well, war and militarism, and it is almost exclusively a male-dominated business, and males start wars. The other thing is, as far as militarism in particular, I don't think that people really sort of associate how serious a threat that is. And it's not, there's a clear, as you pointed out, a very, very clear connection between capitalism, imperialism, and the military, because they couldn't, for the most part, get away without the military backing up. But the military also has its own interests at heart, and it infects almost every level of this country. You only have to look at recent years to look at the number of military, ex-military generals staffing corporate boards, the number of military commentators on channels like CNN and Fox, who are almost unanimous in their support of the war. And finally, you have to look at the conduct of our current two wars. Most of the senior military in this country knew these were bad things to do, in the sense of actually being able to do it successfully, with the exception of the few retired generals who were nicely, safely retired, who were critical of the war. None of the general staff, none of the Joint Chiefs criticized this war. And most notably, retired General Clayton Powell pimped this war even though he knew it was bad. And in fact, for the younger mid-level officers like these lieutenant colonels and colonels, to get a combat command is to rise to general. It's critical. And they are doing this on the backs, literally on the bodies of their soldiers. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with what you're saying. I think it's a huge issue. Obviously, the military brass has got a tremendous lobby. They seem to have access to the waves, the airwaves. You know, given the length of time, I didn't want to get into the military-industrial complex or the arms trade. Those are enormous drivers for war as well. You know, so there are lots of drivers for war. The reason I wanted to address the whole imperialist driver is because we don't talk about it very much. And I just think it's time that gets up there at the highest levels of understanding that complement these other forces that have been so well portrayed.
You know, just one remark about our leaders. If any of you saw the movie The Fogs of War that featured Robert McNamara, who's the defense secretary that got us into the Vietnam War. He also was the CEO of Ford Motor Company and later the president of the World Bank. But he very explicitly describes the firebombing of Tokyo that I referred to, and how we went in there and burned Tokyo because we knew it would kill a lot of civilians, and because it was all made of wood, it would be very incendiary. And afterwards, he made the remark, you know, if we'd lost the war, we would have been tried as war criminals, but we won the war and we were heroes. And that's an incredibly telling statement from that. There are no winners in wars, but there are heroes, and in a sense, we all lose from these wars.
So thanks again to Steve and Stephen.